All right, so tonight's chapter is entitled Feed My Sheep, subtitled How the Church Makes Laws. So that'd be interesting. A television reporter recently asked a Vatican official about the church's stand on birth control. Quote, "If the church is going to have a place in American society," she asked, "why don't you just change your ruling on birth control? You changed your ruling about taking interest on money." What it's talking about is usury, right? The term usury. I think that there are some distinctions because lending practices today help people often gain resources to things that they couldn't have the ability to get before, to build up credit and stuff like that. It's altogether different than the idea of usury, where you're requiring unfair amount of interest that end up just ruining people. I would probably argue some of the use of like the type of interest on credit cards, for instance. It's just super high. It's just super high. I would say that's a form of usury, right? That's what it means in taking interest on money. But our culture is a little bit different. We have financial institutions that actually grow and develop because of interest, and in turn can lend out more and help more people get into a home, 2 beds and a bath, instead of having to grow up and having to crawl to Potter in his slums. The bank and loan. Yeah. Yes. Why my father started this company, I'll never know, but it needs to exist just so there's some place somebody can go other than crawling to Potter. All right. I think that's that's good, The building and loan is a good example of, appropriate lending practices. And then you have Potter, this greedy old man who can't possibly begin to spend all the money you got. It's a faulty analogy anyways that this person was asking here. On more than one level. For one thing, the church has never objected to the principle of interest. There are some biblical warnings against taking payment for a loan, but they refer to an entirely different matter. No, I'm sorry. It's this. I don't like this song because there's words. I just want to listen to something in the background. There we go. In the ancient world, there were banks, but the idea of debt was abhorrent. You borrowed money because you had to, because your crops had failed, maybe, and you needed the money to keep yourself and your family alive. Nowadays, you usually borrow money because you want to buy a new car or start a business or something. The lender offers you the use of his money, his property, and has every right to accept payment for it. This is pretty much like if you're renting, right? If you're renting an apartment or something, it's owned by somebody else, but they're letting you use their property for, a monthly wage. Money is just another form of property. In the same way, you're renting their money, for instance. And while you're using it, they can't put it on deposit for interest. So the lender offers you the use of his money, his property, and has every right to accept payment for it. He's renting you his money, you might say. If the lender asks too much for it, you can go to someone else who asks a lower rate. As long as you have choices at every stage of the transaction, there's no moral objection to interest per se. Still, if you need money to live because of some catastrophe, and somebody takes advantage of your emergency by forcing you to pay for a loan instead of offering outright charity, or charges unfair interest in any circumstance, that's usury, which is and always has been morally offensive to Christians. And the church's regulations on usury have never changed. The reporter's analogy doesn't hold in a larger sense either, in the broader sense of how the church formulates and maintains her teachings. It's not generally recognized in this country that the church can't change her rulings on birth control, nor those on usury. In fact, the church has never changed her ruling on anything pertaining to faith and morals. That's hard for an American to understand. We're used to running things with a Congress that can make or repeal any laws it wants, and a Supreme Court that can interpret those laws any way it likes regardless of precedent. Usually they follow precedent, but we even see some religious denominations meeting in convocation to vote on what they're going to believe about Christ and what they aren't. But the church doesn't run like that, and her unique character is reflected in her laws and customs. He has an asterisk here and some stuff on the bottom. I'll go ahead and read that. The mistaken idea that the church can change doctrine as Protestant denominations do is widespread, but it isn't new. Back in 1850, an Anglican canon of Durham, one George Townsend, was deeply frustrated by the scandalous division of Christianity and couldn't see why the Pope didn't just repeal all of the church's teachings that differed from the Anglican, just as the canon said. The English Parliament would change any law that was no longer convenient. Obviously, he figured that would reunite the denominations instantly. Townsend bustled off to Rome to explain this clearly to the pontiff, and he was attentively received by Pius IX, who thought him an excellent and a good man, and gave him a 40-minute private audience. But for the rest of his life, he could never understand why this sensible proposal wasn't acted upon. Townsend's account of the adventure, Journal of a Tour in Italy in 1850, is incredible and enduring at the same time. I don't get it. Why can't the church just change its teachings? Right? To understand this character, you have to step back and look at religion as a whole. Some religions are assembled piece by piece over the years by people who observe the workings of nature. Hinduism is one such religion, as are the animal-based or spirit-based religions of North American native cultures, or those of Africa and the Pacific Islands. These developed religions continue to evolve and change, sometimes adding new gods to their pantheon, or even absorbing whole other religions when new tribes move into the region. Some other religions are based on the ideas of a single teacher, as Buddhism is, or Confucianism. As time goes on, and as the religion moves into new territories, other teachers add to the original body of doctrine or change it to accommodate different beliefs. Or more, usually, they produce new writings under the teacher's name but adapted to the new social situation. After a few hundred years, usually nobody can tell with any certainty exactly what the teacher said in the first place. Another asterisk here. Just a few years ago, for instance, archaeologists in China unearthed a silk manuscript of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, the centerpiece of Chinese religion and thought. This unique discovery let scholars reconstruct something closer to the original text, which lots of different sects and cults had improved out of existence during the past 2,000 years to make it fit their own predetermined beliefs better. But no comparable early writing of the teachings of Confucius or the Buddha has come to light, so we're left with all the various quote-unquote improvements in these cases. Each sect still has its own version of these teachers' doctrine, and they're all different. But Christianity is a revealed religion, not a one that's developed over a long period of time. So are Judaism and Islam. They claim to have been designed in the mind of God as a whole and given to humans one way or another. Muhammad said that the angel Gabriel came to him and dictated Al-Quran to him word for word. Moses, Abraham, and the other fathers of Judaism received the Old Covenant from God, often by speaking with him directly. And through the prophets of the Old Testament, God revealed his plan of salvation to people, and then came as Christ to reveal the culmination of that plan. But the plan itself in a revealed religion doesn't change. Once you get a body of divine revelation, human beings can't add to it or take anything out, or the rest of it doesn't make any sense. A revealed religion is a sort of package deal. You have to take the whole thing or leave it. You can see this in what Christ said when the time came for him to ascend to heaven again. He gave his church a unique mission. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. That's a specific order. He didn't say, tell people about me in any way you think right, but teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. It means that the church has to stick with precisely what was revealed, never to alter it, which no human has the power or authority to do if you believe that Christ is the Messiah. Keeping a body of teachings intact is evidently beyond the power of human beings by themselves. It's never happened for very long, except in Judaism and Christianity, but the preservation of the teachings has always been of paramount importance to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Quote, "This is my covenant with them, said the Lord, my spirit that is upon you, and the words that I have put in your mouth shall not depart out of your mouth, nor out of the mouths of your children, nor out of the mouths of your children's children, says the Lord, from now until forever." Christ reiterated the promise too, another guarantee that the church wouldn't lose the revelation that he suffered and died for. So in the church today, you have an unchanged body of teachings, the deposit of revelation to start with. Principles of conduct are either consistent with this revelation or they're not. Once the church has stated a ruling based on that revelation, that's it. The teachings can't change later, no matter what the social pressures might be. And when you think about it, to which society should the universal church bend? 12th century Armenia? 1st century Rome during the persecutions of Nero? 20th century America? 18th century France? 3rd century Syria? No. The universal church would never have been able to preserve Christ's teachings had she changed whatever her ideals didn't match those of a particular secular culture. This means that the church makes regulations about faith and morals just the opposite from the ways that secular governments make laws. Our congresses and parliaments react to new situations by making new kinds of laws. But the church reacts to a new situation by articulating the gospel in light of that situation. The church never innovates or invents. She just articulates. Her pronouncements about faith and morals are not just arbitrary matters of thou shalt not, still less matters of personal opinion of the hierarchy. They're simply logical statements that certain ideas and acts are incompatible with Christianity. And the more you know about Christianity, the more reasonable the rulings seem. After all, the hierarchy doesn't sit around making up nitpicky rules like the one about whether idly chewing a blade of grass violates the Eucharistic fast. These rulings happen because somebody asks about the matter, and the hierarchy is obliged to give an answer consistent with the deposit of faith, no matter how silly they may feel about the case in question. Usually they express general principles in response to specific questions, as Christ did. So you need to study any ruling that's hard to understand at first, but in the long run, this clears up a lot of things because you learn the principle. And the principle remains the same throughout many articulations, even though each pronouncement is couched in language that people in that particular time and place will understand. This continuing process of clarification, not change, has always been the church's way. The epistles were written like that in response to some specific difficulty that had arisen. People started misinterpreting a point of doctrine or whole lots of doctrine, as they were in Corinth before the ink was dry on the New Testament, and they needed a direct and clear statement of faith and morals as relevant to their specific case. You can see this kind of crystallization in canon law. Canon is from the Greek word meaning a ruler, like the ones that nuns used to keep our attention in grade school. It means a standard, either a law or a definitive list of parts of something, like items in a code of law or the books of the Bible. I should probably add here that my children go to a Catholic school. There's not a single nun there. Not one. Bring on the rulers. Anyways, canon law gives guidelines for actions, not for beliefs. Okay, we're talking about canon law here. It has to do with the management of the institutional church, not with faith and morals, which are embodied in the Bible and dogmatic documents of the great councils and the popes. For the mechanics and rationales of public worship and the sacraments, there are liturgical books that give participants proper words to say and direct their actions, and that give full explanations of liturgical rules. For the basic regulations, there are 6 commandments of the church. Those are easy. Attendance at Mass and rest from servile labor on Sundays and holy days of obligation. Fast and abstinence as directed, but note that the details of this are left open to change. Confession at least once a year if your sins are serious. Reception of the Eucharist at least once a year during the Easter season. Adherence to the Church's rules on marriage, and support of the Church according to your means. No one shall come before me empty-handed, as it says in Ezekiel. All of these kinds of regulation are closely interwoven, but canon law as such confines itself to what you call the discipline of the community of the faithful in its public life. It doesn't try to judge or compel anyone's personal conscience. Canon law is as old as the church. The disciplinary decrees of the popes, the decretals, are one important source of canon law, and they came about much as the epistles had, prompted by specific questions or problems, but understood as binding expressions of the universal church's uniform practice. Again, they deal with the application of principles. There are also local written records of custom, and these too were set down, beginning very early in the church's life, to establish usages against innovations in improprieties. And also, very early on, bishops of a certain region or province began having more or less regular meetings, getting together to address general crises or just to keep things running smoothly in general. The first ecumenical council, one that included all Christian bishops, was held at Nicaea in 325 AD. It established the Nicene Creed, a standard statement of Christian faith that was needed to distinguish the faith from certain heresies that had arisen. But it also set forth matters of discipline, things like clerical celibacy and the rules about the ordination of bishops that have remained the same until today. It's talking about the canons, right? The canons of the council. Not only did they formulate the creed, but they had these canons laid out. And you could actually read what the canons of the council are. Over the next 1,000 years, the church made collections of decretals, but it was hard to keep up. In 1500, 6 previous collections were published together in a collection of collections. The Corpus Iuris Canonicum. Anyways, literally the body of canon of law. The body of canon law. This was the main source of church regulations for the next 400 years. But it was unwieldy, to say the least. A good percentage of the questions that it answered had come up once upon a time and never again, and addressed perennial questions in little pieces scattered throughout the volumes. The great jurist of Christendom indexed it 6 ways till Sunday, but you still couldn't easily find all the regulations on whatever question you had. And even if you did track down all the references to a topic, they could seem ambiguous or contradictory. Of course, the jurists themselves knew the material forward and backward, and they knew how to get behind the items to the principles, but a browse through the old corpus really gives you a healthy respect for their scholarly stamina. Fortunately, one of the world's greatest reformers became Pope in 1903, Pius X. He had pretty well had it with the impenetrable tangle of the old corpus. And the first thing he did when elected was order the collecting of the laws of the universal church in a clear and concise order and adapting them to the conditions of our time. Keep in mind that they could be adapted to the times because they didn't directly touch unchangeable faith and morals, and that he meant by that phrase that they should address 20th century questions uniformly. So St. Pius X and his canonists sorted through 2 millennia of incredibly complicated material. They threw away a lot of obsolete laws, brought other partial laws together into single canons, and smoothed out ambiguities, rewriting the canon in a subtle and precise style that sets a high standard for anybody's legislation. They extracted overall guidelines and grouped the laws by subject. The way that the law could anticipate questions that would arise in the future. They got the job done in only about 10 years. You get the impression that they'd all been chopping at the bit for some time, and in 1917, the Pope promulgated the new codex, the Code of Canon Law, in 1917. Old habits die hard, though, and in just a few years, the code had picked up all kinds of additions. They were necessary, but they were contrary to the whole point of having things codified. John the 23rd saw that things were on their way to confusion again, and he ordered the renovation of the canon law in 1959. This update took longer than the first codification, from then until 1983, because it was part of the overall reforms of the Second Vatican Council. But it got all necessary regulations down to 1,752 individual canons. It sets the precedent that you need to update the code every 50 years or so, and it sets the standard for future renovations. It's concise, clear, and consistent. And it's very easy to use. You can carry the whole thing in your pocket, yet it governs a church of 800 million. All of these sources together, canon law, liturgical books, and the rest give you a fair perspective on anything that looks like a change in the church's way of doing business. The next time you have a question, look it up. The next time you hear a reporter ask one of these ill-informed questions, call the station. He did seem in this particular chapter to talk more about canon law, but at the very least he mentioned liturgical books, right? He talked about liturgical books, but I think most of the time he ended up talking about he explained what usury was and how, you know, the church isn't going to just change its teaching for anybody, and then mentioned liturgical books, but then spoke the rest of the time about canon law and how, you know, the various canons and how to deal with certain matters within the church are not a matter of faith and morals. That's like basically what he talked about. Well, I suppose that's interesting. I think the whole point of his chapter was to explain what sort of things could change in the church and what things can't. When it comes to faith and morals, those things can't change. They just can't. Because unlike religions that develop, over a long period of time, a revealed religion, like the Judeo-Christian tradition, we are unmoved in that which came before. We can't reinvent it. We can't reformulate it. It is what it is. So cultures change, societies change, governments change, and guess what? Not going to change. Not going to change. In one of my YouTube videos over the past year, I explained that one of the things that's nice about being Catholic is that it's not molded by society. So if you have a whole bunch of progressives who want to just redefine everything, guess what? Catholic Church is unchanged. You can't change that. And although I'll argue for the legitimacy of the papacy all day long, I'm not a huge fan of Francis, for instance. And no matter how progressive he may personally be, he can never change Catholic teaching. He just can't. He can say all kinds of scandalous things, and it doesn't unearth anything. There's nothing he can do about it. Because a pope can't redefine the faith, you know. And I think one of the things about when it comes to the Catholic Church is that is understanding what the pope can and cannot do. You know, he's supposed to be a servant of servants. He's supposed to be a preserver of the faith. He can't just redefine something in faith and morals, for example. He can't say the complete opposite to something that was taught a long time ago. For some reason, I didn't get any of these texts. I am so sorry, Stannis. I didn't have my scroll all the way down to the bottom, so actually I missed a comment from Hackster as well. I'm so sorry, Hackster. I hope you're still here, because I'm going to read your comment and I'm going to respond. All right, so where are we at? Where are we at now? Oh, I gotta get. I lost quite a few here, so please be patient with me as I try to find where I am now. Alright, Stannis said, in the stream I first chatted with you with Jimbo, you said you want to be a saint. And I'm here to partake in that with you. Oh, thank you, Stannis. Yes, the saving of one's soul and bringing as many people with us as we possibly can is definitely worthwhile. Stannis said again, or said, my first Christian group was not a good experience for me. It was an online gaming group. They were socially conservatives above all things, even though I was new learning the Bible. I rejected their implicit commandment of thou shalt vote Christian conservative and that their votes will save the world of evil. Are you talking about the the Barclay doctrine? The conservative idea of voting for the most viable conservative option in American politics. I would hold to that idea that we really do need to vote that, but we need to explore that and unpack that. And I think that remind me of that some other time, because I think we really need to unpack what it means for a society to structure itself in such a way that it enriches and leads to human flourishing, which really requires for us to define what is virtuous and what is vice. I've talked about that a little bit on the stream, but I know I have some other comments, so I have to move on. Stana says, I lost my best friend, who was a lifelong Christian, and always appearing to be in a Bible thumper, growing up, going to church, even being an elder in his church. When I came to him to try to have fellowship with him after I read the Bible, feeling I finally caught up to him, and he rejected reading the Bible and wasn't talking to me since. That's an interesting story. I have something very similar, Stannis. The Christian friend that led me to Christ won't talk to me anymore because I pointed out that they were perpetuating an anti-Catholic interpretation of a passage. Like the passage, like the interpretation itself was crafted by anti-Catholics specifically to attack Catholic doctrine. And there's no history of interpretation of that passage in that way at all that you can find in the early church fathers. And when I pointed out to him, and I said, you're actually just perpetuating anti-Catholic interpretations, he didn't like the fact that I was calling him anti-Catholic in this, and he decided that he wanted to end our friendship as a result. I mean, just own it, I mean, like, I'm trying to show you something, but he didn't want to see it, right? All right, I got to get some other. And wow, I only scored in the top 1,000 in world competition. Well, that's pretty impressive, though. 1,000. That's actually pretty good. Let's see. I'm getting a Hackster here. I got one more. Isn't there another model in Muslim countries for banking? I'm going to have to express my ignorance here. I'm not quite familiar with what Muslims countries do in terms of banking. And somebody knows, please feel free to share. All right, Hackster, here we are. All right, I did jump down here. He says, I'm just goofing, kind of. Interesting stuff. Okay, Hackster, you said, note that salvation is offered to Charlie. The other children freely deny it, but Charlie accepted it. The Oompa Loompas are message bearers who cheerfully and faithfully serve their master, reminding others that God has a plan, purpose, and design. They sing their songs of truth and wisdom in a world that desperately needs both. Oh, I see Charlie. That's funny, Hackster. Thanks for your contribution there. That's funny. Stannis says, what does the Vatican I and II do? I think maybe what you're asking is, okay, so you had the ecumenical councils of Vatican I and Vatican II. All right, so Vatican II was more of a pastoral council. That's the way that Pope Paul VI speaks of it. That it's talking about the ordinary magisterium. That they weren't defining any new dogma in any extraordinary way. For instance, they wanted to be able to set forth how to communicate Catholic doctrine to the modern world. In general, that is most of what Vatican II was there to define what is the church and how does it relate to non-Christian religions, how does it relate to the Eastern Orthodox, how does it relate to the Protestants, and what can be said, what do we share in common, what do we disagree about, and stuff like that, right? Now Vatican I was more doctrinal. It talked about the role of the papacy and stuff like that. If I recall correctly, Vatican I actually laid out papal infallibility. But one would have to read the canons and sessions of the First Vatican Council. You can also do the same for the Council of Trent, for instance, which was part of the Counter-Reformation. You think the church was just sitting back and doing nothing and just taking everything, every attack that's being leveled against it during the Protestant revolt? No. One of the things that they did during the so-called Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent. And you can read the Council of Trent on the doctrines of justification, which was actually really good, actually. And how the church formulates the nature of justification and so on and so forth. The sessions and the canons of the Council of Trent on the doctrine of justification is really good, in my opinion. Really good. Stana says, I think that they are just a group that is religiously Republican. That's an interesting phrase. But as an answer to socialism, I mistyped it earlier. I noticed that you read it. They are social conservatives, not Christian conservatives. Okay. So my thoughts on this particular question, like I have some friends who are more libertarian. Those who are more libertarian tend to be more fiscally conservative, but socially liberal, for instance. It's the notion of, live and let live. You do your thing, I do my thing, and so on and so forth. But it's really difficult, I think, to construct purposely, right, a society that is going to incentivize virtue and de-incentivize vice. It requires that we know very specifically what is virtue and what is vice. And traditionally, the moral teachings of the Catholic Church and the Judeo-Christian background has consisted of what is virtuous. We want to promote virtue in our societies. We want to do everything we can to incentivize virtue in our societies because, as Justin Martyr argued, the best Christians are the best citizens. Because we're not just looking at the lives that we want to form for ourselves in terms of human flourishing. We want to be able to create a society where people can flourish in virtue. We want them to be free. And this is where true liberty lies. Not in licentiousness, but in doing the things we ought to do, right? Because vice always ensnares us, and we don't want to promote vice in a society in any way, shape, or form, because it's actually going to take away from our liberty. See, Christian liberty is found not in being free from some sort of external law. Rather, Christian freedom is found in holiness and living a righteous life. For only in the Spirit are we truly free. Only in holiness are we truly happy and free from vice and the snares of sin that drag down our reason and conflict our conscience and inhibit our liberty. See, when you have a clear vision of holiness, you have a clear vision for the type of society you want your children to grow up in. You want your kids to be shaped and formed in a society that's going to help them flourish in virtuous living, right? So in general, the social conservative position is just that. We want the Christian ethic to be the societal ethic because we want people to flourish. So in that sense, I'm not a libertarian. I'm not a live and let live kind of individual when it comes to public policy. I want to be actively involved in shaping society in such a way that I can be proud for my children to grow up in that kind of society, right? Because true liberty is only going to be found in a society that is actually spurring us on in our liberty, right? That used to be the whole purpose of the liberal arts. So that we can learn and grow and develop in such a way so that we can be free to do the things we ought to do, not free to do anything that we want to do. We know for a fact that we don't want to entertain just any ideation. We don't want to experiment with just any inclination. Rather, we want to know decisively exactly what it means to nurture the human person. And I think that the Catholic Church gives a very clear and decisive vision of what the human person is and what they ought to do. And such a person is only free in as much as they do that, right? When all of our actions and our thoughts and our goals are directed towards their proper end, which is to know, love, and serve God, right? Even if a person's not a theist, we have to understand that, particularly in American society, it's based on theistic philosophy, that we have been endowed with certain unalienable rights by our Creator. It isn't the government that gives us these rights. We, the people, form a government to protect those rights which we already have that are God-given, right? In any particular philosophical attack against that which underlies our government, our understanding of the freedoms in which we are endowed with by our Creator, undermines the philosophical assumption of our Constitution. And in a way, you could actually say that atheism as a philosophy actually undercuts, actually inhibits the American vision of promoting Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of morals and so on and so forth. I know that's a lot, I'm sorry, but hopefully I crafted that well enough. It's not so much that their vision of society was wrong. In fact, perhaps their zeal for being socially conservative and voting for the most viable conservative option that's most likely to win against a liberal or progressive in the government. You know, one that's going to promote pro-life principles as opposed to pro-abortion principles, for instance. You know, politically, you have to ask yourself, what kind of society do you want to live in? And what kind of politicians do you want to promote to try and make that happen? And that's where our voting comes in. We get to vote for our representatives, we get to vote for our senators to make those propositions in the House, and those who will vote for those House proposals in the Senate. And hopefully we've also exercised our right to vote, and the particular president of the executive branch, in the hopes that they're not going to veto it. They're not going to send it back to the Senate, which we could still push through with 2/3 majority, but still, that's even harder and less likely in this political climate to try to push anything through. You're lucky to get past the filibuster, but still, yes. It yeah. Nobody's saying anything. Nobody's saying anything, so I don't have anything else to follow up on that. It's a lot of information. I know. That's my political vision. That's my political vision. Where are we at? Got another 15 minutes. Okay. See, actually, that's kind of cool, because see, I mean, that goes beyond our reading, but it also kind of builds upon the idea of something beyond government that actually serves as a principle by which we formulate those things, which and how we should handle certain things in our modern age. Though I'm gonna be honest, Stannis. I think it also has to do with being charitable with people and how we express that vision. Because the way I just explained it, you notice that other than the fact that I mentioned the pro-life distinction, which I didn't have to make that give that example. I never attacked anybody directly in what I proposed. I merely mentioned that I wasn't a libertarian. I wouldn't propose that the only way that you can truly know right from wrong is by experimenting with those things which you later consider to be wrong. I would consider that learning the hard way. But it's an unnecessary journey if we've been blessed enough with the proper way to go from our childhood. My parents weren't very good in this regard. They never cast any sort of political vision for me. They never had the common sense to shut off Skinamax at 3 a.m. They never had the foresight to recognize that I was going to be influenced by anything and everything. And I tell parents that, listen, either you're going to raise your kids or somebody else is. This whole, well, I'm not going to tell them what I think, or I'm not going to share what my religious convictions are and stuff, and this, that, and everything else, because I want them to grow up thinking about all those things for themselves. Do you understand what you're doing? You're giving up your right as a parent to guide your children in the way they should go, and somebody else is going to fill that vacuum. It's going to be public school, it's going to be a teacher they have. Either way, it's going to be a person that's going to influence them in a certain direction, and guess what? You usurped your parental position, handed it over to other people, all in the name of this libertarian so-called virtue that you champion for yourself. Oh, I don't want to tell my kids what my religious convictions are. All you've told me is that you decided not to raise your child, and you're going to let somebody else raise them. At worst, you're actually promoting religious indifferentism. Or you're teaching your kid that they ought not to take your religious convictions to be taken seriously. You're not even willing to formulate an argument. How are they supposed to make their own decision up on something when they're not even presented with what you think about it? A lot to think about. I think a lot of it comes down to having enough conviction to be willing to pass it on to somebody else. Not because of your hubris or because of some narrow-mindedness, but because of true conviction. You've actually spent time and effort thinking about a subject. I think for some people, their political vision of the future is worth dying for. You know, it's all well and good to have a kind of personal conviction for something, you know. But we're not just talking about our own personal salvation. We're talking about whether or not society is positioned in such a way to maximize the influence of virtue. People who are less ensnared by sin, who have been less impacted by it, I think have an easier way about finding God. But also, it varies. I mean, my own personal story is that I didn't really find God until about 18. Though I dabbled with the idea, I think even before. I guess in some ways you can say because I've been down in the gutter. Maybe I can appreciate it more. It kind of reminds me of what Jesus said to that Pharisee when he says that he who loved much, or he who is forgiven much, loves much, and he who has been forgiven little, loves little. And I think sometimes where you have somebody who was actually a prostitute or somebody who was steeped in the pornography industry or something like that, something more modern day, other means of like income along those lines, which builds upon this verse because, you know, the Pharisee was like, if you really knew who this person was that was touching your feet, you know, if you were really a prophet, you would know the type of life that she lives or lived. But the thing is when Jesus said, those who are forgiven much love much, she had dived deeper into depravity, so to speak. All right, she gave way to wayward passions more than those who sat there judging her. That reminds me of I forget, it may be in Mere Christianity, but C.S. Lewis talks about the difference between the biological person and the diabolical person. You know, that woman who has given herself over to everything that is regarding her nature, you know, is probably going to find more grace from God when she seeks it than the guy who tries to make his life all perfect and without fault, but hears the word of God every single week but doesn't do it. This was the way that he kind of styled the diabolical man. So you were born to a single teen mom who rebelled against her mother's instructions about going to church. A rebellion on the baby boomer generation. That's right. The 60s, right? You're talking about the 60s? So I was definitely at a disadvantage in many ways to coming to God. I agree with having that direction from parents is necessary. In simplest terms, it makes life easier and with less struggle. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like, so there's this term in Catholicism, you know, a cradle Catholic. The term is cradle Catholic. They grow up in a Catholic home. They go through Catholic school. They were baptized as babies, confirmed as teens. They're just constantly surrounded by the sacraments and Christian culture at home. And they don't know just how deep the rabbit hole goes. The rabbit hole of depravity. Because they never plunged deep into the mud as the pigs wallow in. They've been like the older brother in the story of the prodigal son. They just always have been there. They weren't the one that dove headlong into depravity. They entertained every ideation, they explored every inclination, and they just gave to themselves whatever they desired. Whatever limited emotional pain, whatever maximized pleasure. And they found it to be an empty way of life, and then they come home. As Jesus says, the angels in heaven celebrate more than the one sheep that was lost and then returned than the 99 who were never lost. Now, I'm not trying to build an argument that people should go play in the mud, although it might sound like that. What I'm saying is, as Paul argued, as sin increased, grace increased all the more. But should we go on sinning so the grace of God might increase? He says no, by no means. But he just recognizes that God he's going to go all the way. He's going to reach you wherever you're at. There's a YouTuber who seems like the brother in his preaching is just don't sin, don't do it, just don't do it. Very difficult for someone to connect with that. For a person who is already habituated a particular virtue, it's easy for them to say, oh yeah, just don't do it, because they've already habituated themselves not to do it. Because maybe they've never developed the habit of vice. Right? But when you're speaking to people who've developed the habit of vice, and they're trying to develop the habit of the virtue, the gospel looks differently from that perspective. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, because I'm speaking directly to what you're saying. There's another guy on Twitch that says he'd rather have a preacher that has sinned and learned how to overcome it so he can help others with it. Now, Paul made a statement once where when he said, you know, I try to become all things to all people so they might have a chance to save them. Now, obviously, he's not talking about sin. You know, there's certainly no justification from that. But I think what is being said is that we preach best from our scars. And sometimes somebody who was where we were can speak to our situation in a way that's unique and timely. And that's fine. If, like, some people struggle with alcoholism, for instance, and they may need somebody who truly understands the battle of alcoholism. Well, that's where they're going to find their grace. Somebody who was where they were, who has, 20 years of sobriety, but struggled for 10 years. Just struggled tremendously. Didn't grasp the grace of God, was always trying to will themselves through another victory, but always found themselves failing and didn't think that God would forgive them and love them through the journey, through the process. Yes, there is a sense in which we need people who have been where we were to inspire us, to encourage us, to lead us. Just as Scripture says that when a person is caught in a sin, we who are spiritual, who are mature, ought to try to help them. But to be careful not to be dragged down into it themselves. You need to be beyond falling back into drinking yourself if you're going to try to help other people who are struggling with drinking, for instance. That's a good basic biblical principle, I think. Right, I can see myself saying to someone, don't smoke, just don't start. Just don't do it. We also know that this is someone that didn't develop smoking. Right, absolutely. Same thing. It's easy for somebody who never developed the habit of doing that. Like for me, seeing a married man preach to me about stopping porn isn't effective at all. And let me speak to this, because I'm wondering if you're implying that because a man is married, he can quote unquote just take care of all of his passions with his wife, and therefore it's just smooth sailing, for instance. Like, the married man has the opportunity to address his frustrations, well, we'll use that word, in a moral manner. And anytime I try to address my passions, I'm using the voice of the non-married person, that that there's no outlet, that there's no moral outlet for that, right? Because this is going beyond the family friendly, so I'll remove that for a minute. Because in like Catholic teaching, even masturbation, for instance, is considered to be immoral. It's an intrinsically immoral act. So that would be correct. There's absolutely no way for a non-married person, to enjoy sexual satisfaction, so to speak, outside of the conjugal act, within marriage, within the confines of marriage. But don't think just because a person is married that solves porn. It really doesn't. Some people who struggled with porn before they got married realized that getting married did not solve their porn issue. It didn't. And it's not because they're not fully satisfied by their wife, for instance. It's not because of that. A man may find a wife that actually challenges him to greater levels of self-mastery. All right. A man may marry a woman who isn't interested very often. Maybe less than once a month, maybe once every 2 months, once every 3 months, that they enjoy the marital embrace together. What is the guy supposed to do with himself for 2 months, 3 months? The temptation to porn still exists. It still exists. Even if it was a matter of like 3 times a week or something like that. I assure you, there are people who have a wife that they can engage in the marital embrace 3 times a week, and they still struggle with porn. They still do it. Here, let me read what you got here. Not necessarily. I do see someone that does have a sexual relationship where idolatry that comes off as someone that can't appreciate someone that is 47 years old who never had that under the law. Right? And I saw it as a sort of consolation for those not being married. I know there are people who are married with porn, that have porn issues. I can appreciate that. But they have that relationship, and it's just something, in my perspective, that doesn't sit right with me. I think maybe what you might be thinking about is some people look at porn for different reasons. So if it's a matter of loneliness, if a man desires to be desired and he's not being desired, wants the companionship of a woman but doesn't have that, we're not even talking about the marital act. We're just talking about intimacy and loneliness and lifelong friendship. I do give you that. I do concede that a person who's struggling with loneliness and wants a lifelong relationship, wants female companionship, wants to be able to come home to somebody every night, for someone to be there, there is an added temptation in some ways in this. Yes, absolutely. Because then we're tempted to try to have a quasi relationship with girls who pretend to like us on the screen. Yeah, I get that. I totally get that. I can sympathize with that. I can. Being married doesn't necessarily solve that feeling, you know, but a good, healthy, strong relationship can be a really good foundation for understanding a person's role in being a husband, being sacrificial, to think of someone other than themselves. Having some of those opportunities, I think, does constitute a kind of a benefit, so to speak, because one of the roles of a spouse is to help the other person in the way of holiness. Santa says, right now I'm replacing that with trust in Jesus and my entering into marriage with him. It's been a process. I totally get that, and that is basically the way of singleness, for instance. You know, some have even spoken of the gift of singleness. You know, I mean, not all single people or people who are called to a life of singleness are priests, and not are even of a religious order or anything like that. Sometimes just, and I think it's more difficult, perhaps, in hey, Rach, welcome in. As in solitude. Oh, like when I talk about loneliness or solitude. Here's the thing: there's been saints who have lived in solitude, like Jerome, for example. If I remember correctly, he spoke of living out in the desert in a cave, no women around, still struggled with temptations to lust, still struggled with wayward desires, and that he had to control and manage his passions with his intellect. He found actually driving himself into study and keeping his mind occupied was a very useful possibility there. Stan says, like I said, in 2019 for you, when you came to Christ fully, so until then, I was 45 without that for me, and in my teens, I noticed the whole... Oh, yeah, I mean, like, most people have. Learning to endure and overcome now. Oh, yeah, it's hard. That stuff's been habituated so early on in our lives. Like, I didn't grow up Christian, so all kinds of things became habituated. And those are challenging, because now it's like you're trying to habituate yourself in virtue, but you still have these lingering vices that have become habituated in your life in the past, and it's what I would call the residual effects of sin. The residual effects. And it's not even that your flesh or your body per se, right? Your biology, your nature is wrong in what it's feeling or experiencing physiology. Sorry, I've got crackers in my mouth and I'm stumbling on my words. The physiology of a person, you know, the dopamine fix, the association with being able to have a quick, instant gratification dopamine spike in relation to loneliness or to sadness or some other negative emotion, for instance. It's very, very common. There's so many reasons, from emotional regulation to trying to alleviate physical pain, the avoidance of emotional pain, the trying to soothing of the emotions or psychological distress, to address loneliness or trauma, childhood trauma, or there's just so many reasons that having that control, that in any particular moment, at any particular time, I can just do this thing that's going to flood my brain with dopamine. You know, it's just a bad fix. It's just a bad fix. And in general, you know, that's where recovery comes in, because this is not just with it could be with like drinking or drugs or smoking or any sort of dependence or chemical issues in the brain, from external things to acts that we may potentially participate in. You know, that the brain develops neuro pathways. So once that dopamine is done doing the job, it's so easy to fall into looking for more. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because here's the thing, and I've actually heard this, the brain is non-moral in this particular sense. So like if your brain starts to obsess or start to crave something that it has enjoyed in the past, it's not doing it because it's evil, right? It's not because the brain it's evil. It's because it's classical conditioning. It has associated the dopamine spike with what it was viewing or what it was doing, and it's also an association with whether or not it was trying to draw you out of a depressive state, which doesn't work, because we all know as soon as you do the thing, whatever that thing is, you know, you get your temporary high, and then it's not only exactly what you were feeling before, but now you feel worse. Now you feel defeated because you allowed yourself to go down that road again, knowing very well that it didn't solve. It was trying to put a round peg in a square hole. It didn't quite fit. It wasn't what you really needed, right? And so it actually becomes an avoidance of addressing the thing that we actually need. We need to actually learn how to manage our own emotions, right? We need to engage in our own emotional regulation. We actually have to work through and process our emotions and not try to just avoid them and fix them by, So you feel sad? Fine. Embrace it. Like Christ embraced his cross. That's so hard to do. Because the problem is the dopamine does its job. It associates pleasure with this thing that gets associated with what you were trying to use it for. And it just becomes this, okay, now how do I stop? You know, that's why I'm actually thankful I never tried cocaine or heroin or ecstasy or anything like that, because God forbid that my brain ends up getting stuck on something that would not only destroy the soul, but would actually destroy my brain and destroy my relationships in life and everything else. Which P can still do. P can still do that. It's just so anonymous, so affordable, so accessible. So one thing that is good for me now, though, is the urge doesn't fulfill at all. I loathe it, I hate it. Well, it's not like you can really do anything, like as a non-married person. That there isn't really anything that you can do. So there's no way out of having to master oneself, subjecting the passions to your intellect each and every single time. And develop that habit over a long period of time. But like, if a person has struggled with P and M for decades, oh man, it's going to be a battle. Don't beat yourself up. It could take years and even decades to develop the habits necessary to finally subdue the wayward passions. I mean, you're fighting against your own brain at this point. The neural pathways that have been galvanized and solidified over a long period of time, even to the point where you will experience the lack of willpower, that you won't even be able to will yourself to do otherwise, because it's been so habituated. That internal force of habit is so strong that without God's grace, without the Holy Spirit, without like help from friends and deliberate attempts to go through a recovery program or something like that, that helps you to connect with your emotions, process them, and find friendships and relationships that can actually serve as legitimate dopamine spikes, for instance, like exercising, eating well, achieving goals, hanging out with friends, celebrating with your friends, having them celebrate with you, sports. There's all kinds of things that we can go to where dopamine is involved. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. Let's see. Stan is saying, because all it does is get me in trouble. Yeah. Yeah, but also remember that God understands where you're at. That's the other thing. Thing is, you may know better now than you used to, and that's good. But God also knows that this isn't going to be an easy thing for you. He knows that what he's asking is to run counter to the way in which we used to live our lives for years. That's just the way it is. Maybe that is me seeing the lie, the illusion before I reject now. Always remind yourself that the passage in Romans, and I think people who struggle with things need to be reminded more often that God loves you. All right? When we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And we need to keep telling ourselves that. This sin that we just did, or that sin that we're going to commit a week from now, or 2 weeks after that, God had that in mind when he died on the cross. You can't out-sin his grace. I don't recommend testing that to the end of your life, of course, right? that doesn't make make any sense at all. But what I'm saying is just remind yourself that he who began a good work in you will continue to bring it on to completion. Right? Will bring it on to completion. Always remind yourself of that. I do appreciate the follow Christianity Destroyer, but I also see that your account was created 39 minutes ago. And so I find you coming in here with that name having recently been created to be a bit disingenuous. So I am banning you. You're always free to listen if you want. Yeah, so always remember, no matter what, we have always been in a worse place in our life. Just think about that. We have been in a worse place in our life. And look what God has done for us since then. Gotta remember that. We can't ever allow ourselves to be duped into thinking that God's just going to give up on us. We've been worse off, and God has done amazing things. Right? Remove sin that I might have committed in the future, long I partake of in his suffering, as long as I still want to establish the ethic of my heart. Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Always keep your eye on the prize, you know, fix your eyes on Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith. Always focus on Christ in that. He who began a good work in you, my friend. He's right there willing to bring it to completion. It's going to be a process, though. You know, God's will is for our sanctification. You know, that we get rid of everything that contaminates body and soul. Perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Being a living sacrifice. Being transformed, and then the renewing of our mind. It's what is called the Christian journey, where we turn from sin and we walk in newness of life, not according to the old man, but according to the new man created in righteousness and true holiness, my friend. Yeah. The thing is we know these things, but we need to be encouraging one another with these words. We need to be able to, we need to hear these words from others. Yeah, we definitely need to hear these words from others. Oh, I was actually planning on only going to 6 today. That's 6:24. So, all right, I will have to get going here in a few minutes. I do appreciate everybody hanging out today. We did some really good, decent conversations early on about what is a Christian. We also talked a little bit about this book that I've been reading. We read chapter 2 of Why Do Catholics Do That? He talked a lot about like canon law and the unchanging doctrine of the Catholic Church, and we had some subsequent conversations. And I think that we've had some really good conversations. And I'm very much glad to have all of you here to chat about some stuff. Alistair Crowley Apprentice. Welcome on in. And also welcome to Twitch as well. I see that you created your account yesterday. Hope you're enjoying your stay in Twitch. A lot of good content here on Twitch, by the way. I think there's a little bit of something for everybody now, that they're not strictly gaming only like they used to be. Heck, I had a friend who was he was banned or suspended for 3 days because he streamed himself shoveling snow. Like, if he did that now, it's just like in real life, right? It's the IRL tag. But nowadays, it's just nice to be able to. I don't know. I guess I kind of liked it when it was gaming only stuff too, because they kind of opened the door to some things that are kind of inappropriate, I think. But I liked like the art and the music and things that other people do. So yeah, one can enjoy all those things without actually having an account made, you know. But if you want to chat and participate and chat and stuff like that, then yeah, you would have to create an account to be able to do that. But all right, folks. Oh, that, and actually have a follow list. That's you know I never really thought about that. I never really thought a person creating an account explicitly for having a follow list, so that when you jump on Twitch, you can see which of those people that you follow are actually live. It's very convenient, even if you never chat anywhere and you just lurk. Which is actually, that's another really good reason why to create an account if somebody doesn't have an account. So, all right, folks, thanks for hanging out. God bless all of you. I don't think I've done this before, but I'll just pray for you folks, man. In nomine Oremos. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. God, may you just bless everybody watching today. You know our hearts. You know our needs. We just turn our hearts towards you, turns our minds towards you, and we ask that you would bless us in the way that we need it the most. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et hora mortis nostrae. In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, God be with each and every one of you, and God bless, and we shall see you later.